Ivo, my partner in the executive coordination of the school, will give some information. Please, Pedro, the floor is for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amancio, and big thanks to Marga for bringing the relevant topic of the moment to discussion here at Inside SP. I'm equally happy to see many of the alumni of Inside SP and also the lecturers, some of the lecturers among the audience today. And also too happy to see new names, meaning that the Inside SP community is growing. And I think that's the aim. Three very quick points I would like to mention here. First, well, it happened 3 months ago, but I think it's important that we officially acknowledge the fact that our dear friend, Professor Ari Plonsky, was awarded with the Trajectory Innovation Prize of the USP Innovation Agency. And well, I think the award is with regards to his, let's say, career, which was devoted to innovation and innovation policies. So I think it's well-deserved, Professor Ari. We are very honored to have you as part of the executive committee of Inside SP. Well, second, what I'd like to mention is that well, our São Paulo framework of innovation diplomacy, I'm very happy to say that it has been very well received by the international community. Some governments have approached us to say that they are using the framework as reference for their national innovation policy. And I think that's a matter of pride to all of us. It's a document we crafted together. And I would like to ask you to keep on the good work in promoting the São Paulo framework of innovation diplomacy, promoting debates around it, writing about it. So I think so we can further spread the word about this document, which is a real major milestone in the still recent history of innovation diplomacy. Finally, last but certainly not least, I have the honor to announce that the second edition of Inside SP is going to happen from 3rd to 7th of August this year. Given the current circumstances and all the, let's say, the limitations that it entails, we'll have the edition 100% online. But similar to last year's edition, we are organizing a set of panels and also lectures and also practical activities with the students so that we can further, let's say, promote the discussion on science and innovation diplomacy. We will be soon, actually by middle of next month, start the application process for the school. We this time will aim at having 50 Brazilian students and 50 international students. And well, I cannot at this moment disclose the program, but as a teaser, let me say that Professor Sumita Dutra, who is from the Cornell University, and he is the one who created the Global Innovation Index. He has accepted to give one of the lectures to our school this year. And please follow us up on our website and also on our social media to have more information and more details about the program, Inside SP program for this year. So now I think I've said enough. So let's now move on to Marga. Marga, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigada. It's a pleasure to reconnect with you, Professor Amancio and Pedro Ivo and everybody. involved in the school. It was a fantastic event last year. I see many of the participants in the chat, so I'm very glad that so many of you are coming back to this side event, and also for the announcement of the next edition. So for anyone that did not participate last year and is now in the audience, I encourage you to apply as soon as the applications go out next month. So it's a pleasure for me to give a little bit of analysis and discussion about the situation that we have globally. Of course, we have a global pandemic that has many science and health diplomacy dimensions. So it was a good opportunity for us to analyze and have a bit of a discussion around this current topic that is almost providing us with a live case study, if you will, on many of the aspects of science, health, innovation, technology, diplomacy that we have been dealing with. And so it will be a bit of an overview of science diplomacy for the people in the audience that did not attend the school last year, but we will also focus on the topic at hand. And let me also wish everybody health, and hopefully everybody is safe and healthy, and your families anywhere in the world that you are. So I will share my screen now. Hopefully this works. This is always the critical moment. And okay, is this working? Amancio? Yes, okay.
Yes, you can see.
Perfect. I just wanted
Thank
some
you.
feedback to ensure we're working, everything is as should. So I'll just tell you a bit about me and who am I and what my work has been in science diplomacy. As I said, a bit of an introduction and an overview of science diplomacy for those who might not be so familiar with the concept. And then we'll talk about COVID-19 and how science diplomacy is extremely relevant for this scenario that we're living right now, and also think a little bit about the future. So what kind of world are we going to get after this, and what are the implications for geopolitics and the world order and the place for science and health and innovation in this new world. So just a little bit about me. I am from Spain. I'm from Mallorca, where I'm right now, but I've had a career all over the world. I've been privileged and fortunate to work both on the scientific side, but also on the policy and diplomacy world. So I have a PhD in molecular biology in Australia, but after that I switched and for my postdoc and career afterwards, I entered the world of international policy and diplomacy, first through the United Nations in New York, and then I moved to Washington, D.C. for the last 5 years. I spent at the AAAS, Center for Science Diplomacy, which was the first institution that was created to really bring together the community and put the definitions and the frameworks around science diplomacy. And I will talk a little bit about those in a minute. So as a scientist, for me, it was very unknown. The word diplomacy never seemed to be to go with science at all during my studies. And I think many of the, many people that are in the audience and many of the students and scientists that we interact with, they don't have a sense of how science and diplomacy can go together, because we are immersed in silos, right? Our education is always separate. And until very recently, for a science student, or especially in the natural sciences, you would never cross in your faculty or your department or your school somebody studying international law or political science or international relations. And so these two worlds have been separated in theory for a long time, but not in practice. And so science diplomacy is something that has a long tradition, but only recently we have given it this name, this concept, this framework, and that allows us to make it operational. So the first time that I heard about diplomacy, I like to put this quote from Winston Churchill and Henry Wotton, who was an English diplomat, about how science, how diplomacy is basically the opposite of science, right? Diplomacy is about getting others to do what you want, but in a nice way, so they don't realize that you are leading them towards that goal. For me, it had to do with secrecy or with protocol or with non-transparency, with discretion and tactics and negotiation. And science was something that was for me open, international, transparent, collaborative. And so for me, those two worlds were opposite until I crossed to the other side. At that time, it seemed to me that diplomacy or politics or anything that was outside of my little bubble in the scientific academic world, it was very foreign. It was not something that I could directly relate to. And so for me, I thought science should have an impact in the world. But how can we scientists have that impact if we don't really know how the world works, right? And that is the domain of international relations and studying how policy works, how a law is made, and how the public policy cycle works. So when scientists, we say we want to have an impact in policy, many times we don't know what policy is and how policy is made. So for me, the key turning point in my career was to bring these two worlds together and help the scientists understand this other world of public policy, diplomacy, and international relations, and basically global affairs. And also to help put more science and technology and innovation and health, these subjects that perhaps are not so common in diplomatic academies or the foreign service. And so how can we bring these two worlds together is now the domain of science diplomacy. And for 10 years, we've had this field or this new subject of area of study. So just very quickly, diplomacy is really an art, right? It's the art of conducting international relations through negotiations, treaties, alliances, in a way that is peaceful, in a way that is non-coercive, that is non-military. So it is about managing international relations in a peaceful way. When a country conducts diplomacy, it is based on foreign policy strategy. That is, every country defines and designs their foreign policy, and then diplomacy and diplomats are the ones who go out and execute that foreign policy. So basically, it is the boundary between the domestic and the international environment. But this traditional definition of diplomacy really is changing and very fast is impacted by the global challenges and globalization. And in the last few decades, we've seen how diplomacy is no longer just the domain of nation states, right? So we have globalization intensifying all of these cross-boundary interactions. Climate change is bringing us new problems that need to be addressed collectively, right? And all of these threats are transboundary, meaning that no country can solve them on its own. And the pandemic now is accelerating our understanding of that very well. So in the 21st century, we are confronted with a new set of issues that develop a new agenda, right? A new international agenda. And those new types of diplomacies are emerging to precisely address those transboundary challenges that perhaps no traditional diplomacy can alone address. And those include health diplomacy, digital diplomacy, disaster diplomacy, and of course, science diplomacy. And there are many of those new fields or flavors of diplomacy. And that is also bringing new actors. So it's not only, as I was saying, the role of nation states to conduct diplomacy. Now we are seeing the increase in importance of non-state actors, of cities, of subnational governments, states, as well as private companies, transnational corporations, tech diplomacy, and different groupings and geopolitical configurations that are changing very fast in response to these new challenges. So as I was saying, for me, when I first learned about diplomacy as a scientist, it seemed completely opposite. And these differences between the worlds of science, the culture, the values of science and diplomacy are very well described in this book that I recommend by Daryl Copeland, who is a former Canadian diplomat who wrote this book, Guerrilla Diplomacy, which is fantastic to really juxtapose these two worlds of science and diplomacy and to really understand why they seem to come from such different domains. But then as we enter in the world of the 21st century challenges, we obviously need them both to work together. So science is what we call a source of soft power. So soft power is a term coined by Professor Joseph Nye, of Harvard Kennedy School, and he basically differentiates between hard power and soft power. We were talking in the beginning about how diplomacy is about conducting negotiations and relations in a way that is non-violent. For instance, hard power is about using military force, is about using coercions and payments and sanctions and embargoes. There are many ways that you can force somebody to do something, but you can probably gain more if you are using things that they value about you. So that is the power of attraction. So you can use a culture, you can use arts, you can use music, you can use education, you can use science. For instance, countries that have the best educational and scientific enterprise attract the best minds of the world. They want to go study in those universities and conduct research in those places. So that is a pole of attraction that you can use to gain a competitive advantage in the world without having to force anyone to do anything. So this is so science is part of this soft power coined by Joseph Nye. And in the 20th century, we see very clearly how science can act as this bridge and to be this first approach when countries, especially when they come out of war or after long periods of conflict. We see that the first agreements and the first collaborations that can be formed are scientific agreements, because science is more neutral and it's easy to agree to do science together for countries, right? It's more tricky to perhaps agree on human rights and other more delicate issues, but science is a thing that's probably in the interest of both to work together. And so we can see many examples of countries coming back from conflict and signing scientific agreements, such as the US and China or with Japan. But also we have the EU and in Europe, the construction of CERN, which is the Large Hadron Collider, very well known for being the place where the Higgs boson was found. That laboratory was built after World War II to bring together the East and the West, former enemies in Europe, and help the physicists and the scientists from both sides to work together and start building those collaborations to advance physics. But also those collaborations, for instance, allowed the first contact between Israeli and German scientists after World War II. Also, we have examples of collaboration in space that cannot happen on Earth. So in the Cold War, we have the US-Soviet Union space collaboration, and it was very symbolic because there's this picture called Handshake in Space, where the Soviet and the American astronauts basically show collaboration in orbit. That's not possible on Earth at that point. So it is really symbolic of the value and the importance of continuing science collaboration despite political or other differences. And today we have a modern example of that, similar to CERN, that brings countries together. In this case, it's in the Middle East, in Jordan. Sesame is a synchrotron that brings together 10 Middle Eastern countries that, as we know, they might not be in the best political relations, but they agree to bring their scientists together to cooperate in this scientific facility in Jordan. And so, as I was saying, science diplomacy was not formalized as a concept, even though it was a long practice, as we have just seen, until this landmark report called New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy. And this was done by the Royal Society in the UK, which is the Academy of Sciences in the UK, and the AAAS in Washington, DC. And so the definition of science diplomacy that was put forward at the time was that science is a common ground to build international partnerships, manage common resources, address shared challenges, and improve political relations between nations. This definition has evolved very much, and many of our colleagues here, Professor Ruffini and others, have worked to evolve and improve this definition. But at the basic level, we can say that science diplomacy has three pillars. The first one would be about how the diplomatic apparatus and the diplomatic system can help advance science. The second pillar would be how science can inform diplomatic relations. And in the same way that we talk about evidence-informed policy, we can also talk about evidence-informed diplomacy, especially at the multilateral level in negotiating in international treaties or managing global commons that have no national jurisdiction. And we'll see some of that in a minute. And then the third pillar of science diplomacy is about the conflict space, right? How can science and scientific collaboration can be a bridge for building or repairing relationships, political relationships when those are strained. So in the diplomacy for science pillar, we have very visible examples. For instance, large research infrastructures. Those are scientific facilities, but underlying those facilities, there is a diplomatic treaty. And I found that, I mean, for me as a scientist in my previous life and many of my colleagues, we didn't really know that that those scientific facilities had a diplomatic agreement underneath, right? So we thought scientists would just go and observe at the telescope or conduct experiments and at this synchrotron that we were talking about. These large facilities really require a diplomatic agreement. Basically, the diplomats have to come together and decide who participates in this facility, who funds it, who can, what are the rules of participation? How many hours can you have depending on what you pay? What happens if you don't pay? So can you be a full member, an observer? All of those things are written off as bureaucracy many times by the scientists. And we're like, oh, this is boring bureaucracy, paperwork. We don't want to deal with this. We just want to do the science. But without the key role of the diplomats negotiating these agreements, those facilities would not exist. And it's not only about big science, it's also about getting a research permit, getting a visa. So if you are a scientist that want to go to another country to do research, you need a visa, probably. So those are really important roles for embassies and consulates to allow scientific mobility around the world. And this is not to say that science cooperation has to be mediated by the government. Obviously, we know that science collaboration happens organically, and scientists collaborate with anyone in the world without major problem. Of course, now that we have the internet, it's not even necessary to travel to cooperate. So it's not that all scientific collaboration has to be mediated by governments, but there are very important instances like the ones I just described, where the intervention and the support of the government embassies is extremely important for successful partnerships. And here you have a number of these facilities: CERN, as I was mentioning, the European Southern Observatory in Chile, the International Space Station, obviously, and Sesame, as I mentioned. All of those are scientific and diplomatic facilities, if you will, or infrastructures. So the second pillar of science diplomacy is what we call science informing diplomacy. And the most obviously clear examples are for instance, getting an agreement on a global common, for instance, managing the high seas that have no national jurisdiction, or getting a climate agreement. Climate change is a global problem that we cannot solve individually as nations. We have to come together to address it. And so after World War II, we see an increase on all of these international agreements, most of them under the United Nations conventions and frameworks, basically designed to manage common interests. So we, as a planet, we can manage our common spaces together. And there are many of those treaties: deep sea, outer space, Antarctica, the high seas. These are all global commons that belong to no one, and they have to be managed collectively. And here we have an example of the high seas. You see the dark blue is the parts of the ocean that belong to a national jurisdiction, but most of the other map, you see the light blue, is the high seas. And these are 2/3 of the ocean has actually no national jurisdiction and needs to be managed together. And so this is the challenge. How do we, if you think about the planet, we have 30% of the planet that belongs to somebody, but then 70% of the planet that does not belong to a particular country. And so it is a huge challenge for us to manage those spaces together. And one of the most successful and symbolic examples of this is Antarctica. So the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. It was the height of the Cold War, so it's even more important that it was successful. And this was the last continent that had not been yet colonized, and there were no human activity, but there were many claims, territorial claims from different countries that wanted to have a portion, a slice of Antarctica. But thanks to science collaboration, in 1958, in the International Geophysical Year, scientists went to Antarctica and set up these facilities and laboratories and research infrastructures in Antarctica. And they realized that in a place that is so harsh and hostile and cold, it is really much better to work together rather than everybody having their own piece of the continent. And so Antarctica became this global international laboratory for studying climate change, and obviously today it is our most important sensor or sentinel for climate change. And it has remained for 60 years as this global common managed by all of us in the interest of peace and science. And hopefully it remains for many more decades like this. And then it is not just about scientific agreements being successful, right? So it is very symbolic, I think, as well, that one of these scientific diplomatic agreements, like the Montreal Protocol, this is the agreement that managed to close the ozone hole layer. As you know, we in the 80s we had a very important problem on Antarctica. There was a hole in the ozone layer, and that was caused by this CFCs. I never know the word. The CFCs are chemicals that are refrigerants, and they were emitted by spray cans. Remember those spray cans that had CFC in the label, but also were used for cars, for fridges, for basically our modern common living. The common our modern standards of living in many ways were enabled by those technologies, right? So when the scientists warned that there was this problem, that the CFCs were causing a hole in the ozone layer, of course, governments had to get on board to decide, so what can we do? So one of the approaches was to ban these chemicals, ban the production and the manufacturing of these chemicals. But of course, that meant that a lot of industries would not be happy because they would basically be out of business because those manufacturers were very powerful. So the solution was to align the science, the politics, and the industry. And that, tripartite agreement was what really allowed this agreement to be successful, because industry was able to innovate and leapfrog and produce non-harming substances and replace the CFCs that were causing the ozone layer. So that really shows how important it is to have all stakeholders on board. For when we talk about science diplomacy and science-based agreements, it is not just about science and the diplomatic sphere, it is also about industry. And when we talk about climate change, we see it is much harder for industry to fully get on board to phase out fossil fuels and really achieve the energy transition that we need in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And speaking of Paris Agreement, obviously that was another very important success for climate diplomacy, that in this moment we see it not not progressing at the speed that we should. From 2015, many geopolitical scenarios have changed, but in that case, it was another landmark moment of getting all countries together, 195 nations to sign, to commit to climate action. And the latest and the most now, I think, widespread agenda that we can all identify with is the SDGs, right? The UN Sustainable Development Agenda that really provides a framework for meeting our global challenges. And if you look at those goals, science is present in all of them, right? From managing the oceans, from providing clean energy, health, well-being, infrastructures, and clean water, and so forth. And the third and very quickly last pillar of science diplomacy is this idea of science being a bridge when there is conflict or political strain between nations. So I was fortunate to spend a big part of my career working to build bridges between the US scientific community and the Cuban scientific community. As you know, the US and Cuba had been for many decades in a diplomatic freeze. When I started working at AAAS, there were no diplomatic relations in 2013 between the US and Cuba for many decades. What that means is that scientists cannot work together as easily, and they cannot work together on the common challenges. So when you have two countries that are so close together, like the US and Cuba, they face the same challenges. They face threats of hurricanes, of tropical storms. They face infectious disease, tropical diseases that are coming up in latitude because of climate change, you have shared oceans and shared ecosystems that really require the management of all the countries involved. And having this diplomatic conflict really impairs the collaboration that needs to happen between the scientists in those countries. So I worked on bringing the scientists together, and when in 2015 the diplomatic relations were reopened between the US and Cuba, as I described in the previous about the previous agreements in the 20th century, science was the first agreement that was signed. So health, environment, different oceans, different topics were put on the table because the scientists were ready to put something on the table to be signed as a sign of reapproachment between the two countries. So that's why it's extremely important to have the scientific collaboration and communication to not have barriers to that, because no matter how the countries are politically at that point, if you continue maintaining the scientific connection, then it will be much easier to come back when the political circumstances improve. And so how we apply all of this to COVID-19, right? We see very in the headlines, and it is incredibly almost overwhelming for us working in science diplomacy that now all of the headlines of all the major newspapers are about science diplomacy. It is like a life case study, as I was saying. And so COVID-19 is bringing us changes in the scientific world and in the political and geopolitical order. And those responses that we've seen have been quite opposite. So COVID-19 arrives in a time of very, quite a low point for multilateralism, right? I was talking about 2015 and the Paris Agreement, and the time that we really seemed to have the world on track for this climate action and this collective action in to address global challenges. But in the last 5 years, this situation has changed. And so we are faced with a number of rivalries and geopolitical challenges that made the conditions not the optimal for the arrival of a pandemic. And so from the science perspective, what we have seen, it is an unprecedented collaboration. We have seen scientists leave aside all of their authorship and kind of the competitions and just work together, single focus on finding vaccines and treatments and understanding the virus. It is the fastest characterized virus in history. It is amazing how so quickly we were able to understand this disease, and we are still understanding it. We are not done. Every day we find something new about it, but it is really remarkable the speed at which science has worked together. And this is in stark contrast, as the New York Times headline that I show you here put. It said that while political leaders have locked their borders, scientists have shattered theirs and created a global collaboration unlike any in history. And so when we see the response of the global leaders who resorted to unilateral actions, closing borders, and really struggling to incorporate evidence-based advice into their responses. And so I'm not going to go into each of them, but basically the countries that had more robust and the best traditions of science advice and science policy interface, for instance, the US or the UK, they were not the countries that more easily and rapidly incorporated this scientific advice. And this really shows us that it is extremely important to have scientific infrastructures within government agencies, have science advice, have experts, and have this access to expertise. But also, if you have leaders who don't want to hear this advice and don't want to use these scientific interfaces, the science policy interfaces, then how good are these structures, right? So it is really bringing us so many examples and as I was saying, case studies of science advice, because it is not enough to have those structures in place. You have to have them perhaps earlier on, right? Many governments created these emergency science committees, but how much time was wasted in bringing together the experts and scrambling to put together a committee rather than having a long-standing office or mechanism of science advice already inside the government, and that means all of the government agencies, all of the ministries, and especially the foreign ministry, which is the domain that concerns us in science diplomacy. Another interesting angle is the role of these the multilateral organizations and the supranational bodies that have been heavily criticized by many countries. And it is interesting to also explore this part, because I think those organizations don't really, we haven't done a good job of communicating how they work. So for instance, WHO and basically all the UN agencies, they are informed by member states. So it is not like a world government that dictates that this should be done in a pandemic. It is a secretariat that responds to a group of countries called member states, and these countries dictate the work and the work program and the objectives and the strategies that these UN agencies will follow. So it is perhaps a misconception, and perhaps we need to do a better job of explaining that a multilateral body, it's really a member state body. It is not a separate entity that says this country should do this or that, right? So it is the same with the EU, right? How so we've of course heard a lot of criticism of the EU and the role of the EU in responding to the pandemic in Europe, and how it was responding late and uncoordinated, and basically showing a lack of solidarity. And so again, we have to understand how these systems are created. So the EU is based on treaties, and those treaties by the member states basically give the EU powers to do things or not, right? And that is called competences. So if the EU has competences in a particular domain, they can act and they can legislate and they can impose measures across the entire EU. But for instance, health is not an EU competence. It's a shared competence, and the health systems and the health response, it is still a competence of the member states. So it is not so easy for the EU to rapidly implement a unilateral and coordinated response. And that has to come from the member states, from all the health ministries, from all the foreign ministries to come together. And that really comes to in the science diplomacy space. For instance, the EU does not have a strong yet foreign policy, common foreign policy, common foreign and security policy, as much as it has a common science and research space, right? So many of you know the Horizon 2020 programs, and many of the research budget of the EU is actually open to any member state and open to the world. So science and diplomacy in the EU are at different levels. Research is a common competence and is a very strong mechanism of integration. But foreign policy, each country, each member state likes to keep their own foreign policy, which is understandable, and they like to keep their bilateral relations and geopolitical configurations differently. And so that is the challenge. And I think understanding better how these multilateral organizations work will allow us to then identify ways to improve them and perhaps make them more agile and faster in response. But I think it's an important point that we must understand and maybe do a better job in communicating how they work. And so the headlines of this pandemic are giving us so many examples of these geopolitical reconfigurations of this use of hard and soft power. We see China now basically showing this soft power and presenting itself as a responsible power that wants to help other countries once it has overcome the pandemic. We also see the challenges that countries that are under sanctions or different types of international embargoes and sanction regimes are struggling to import the basic products and protective equipment, right? So this is one of the reasons the UN Secretary General called for a global ceasefire and a global suspension of sanctions to allow all countries to respond to the pandemic and for at least temporarily leave aside all of those conflicts and political and geopolitical situations in order to allow for the best response. And this is really rooted in the idea that if one country, if we stop the pandemic in one country, but we leave it grow in one, that country will probably spread it again to the whole world, right? So it is not effective to have a partial strategy if we don't help everybody, every country to eliminate the pandemic. And we have the example of smallpox that was eradicated because of the WHO global vaccination campaign that basically vaccinated every single person in the world. And that means every country committed to vaccinating the entire population, so there will be no other outbreak that could, if one country or one section of the population would be left unvaccinated, that would then spread the pandemic again. And so it is now a time that countries are showing this soft power. Cuba has a long tradition of medical and health diplomacy, deploying medical brigades to help other countries. And then we have other scenarios that are worth mentioning. For instance, Taiwan. Taiwan had a very good response to the pandemic, but they complain that they're not allowed to share those best practices and lessons to the world because under the One China policy, Taiwan is not allowed to be a full member of WHO or to have direct bilateral relations with certain countries. And so we are seeing so many dimensions of the pandemic that are squarely within the science and geopolitics right now. And as I was saying, there's a big effort in documenting all of this. So one of the organizations that is doing that is INCSA, the International Network of Government Science Advice. They are documenting how each of the countries are responding. What are the science advice mechanisms that are they using? Are they using evidence-based approaches or not? And so if you go to the INCSA, it's INCSA.org COVID. It is a tracker, a policy tracker of all of the responses from a science advice and a science diplomacy angle that countries are taking. So how do we boost science diplomacy? How do we move forward? And how can we strengthen these interfaces so we can avoid the next pandemic? And that applies to every global challenge, not just health. So there are many countries and groups that are starting to have science diplomacy strategies at the highest levels of government. I was involved in devising the science diplomacy strategy for the EU, working with the former Commissioner Moedas. And basically, he made a very big push for kind of a top-down approach for the EU to use science to increase its presence and its global standing in the world. So the EU as a global power, how we can use the scientific enterprise relationships and all our scientific programs to really promote the values of the EU around the world and help address global challenges. And this came also with a very important result, which was that the science diplomacy became also a topic for research in the EU. So in the Horizon 2020 program, which is the framework program for research in the EU, for the first time, science diplomacy became one of the items. So 3 projects that I'm fortunate to have been involved very closely and continue to be involved very closely in them. 3 projects were selected to conduct this research to bridge the academic, the most theoretical aspects, but also the practical aspects of science diplomacy. And they have really done an amazing job at creating and galvanizing a science diplomacy community, not just in Europe, but from all around the world, both on the academic side, but also diplomatic academies are involved and many other types of institutions. So I recommend, if you don't know the projects yet, I recommend that you check them out, sciencediplomacy.eu. And then at the national level, this has also, we have also seen an increase in higher level strategies. For instance, Spain in 2015 published a science diplomacy strategy together. The science ministry and the foreign ministry came together for devising this strategy.
Você pode me ligar daqui a
And then
uma hora mais
sorry, there's somebody. And then as part of this European project, S4D4C that I show you, Spain also launched this Madrid Declaration on Science Diplomacy that outlines a set of principles and guidelines for countries willing to strengthen their science diplomacy actions. The same with Panama. It was the first Latin American country to publish a science diplomacy strategy. Here you can see it by the former foreign minister and vice president, and she was a champion. Basically, she wanted to have to position Panama as a scientific power, right? And using the strategic position of Panama and logistic capabilities, biodiversity, and the fact that 80%, I think, of the country is ocean. So what are the strengths in science and environment that Panama can help to position itself and increase the global standing? So you can read that strategy. And obviously, a lot of the work that needs to be done is to strengthen the scientific capacity and advice and interfaces within foreign ministries and diplomatic academies. So I have been working with many of you in the audience. I see in Mexico, in Panama, in Chile, and many of the Latin American countries that are really taking this up very, very seriously. And of course, Brazil and Sao Paulo. So here's the strategy that Pedro Ivo mentioned in the opening, the Sao Paulo Framework of Innovation Diplomacy that came out of the summer school last year. And it is really a fantastic document that is, as he said, being used as a model and example for others. And so what we can learn from this is that there are national strategies, but also increasingly there are subnational and other types of actors at different levels that are engaging in science diplomacy. So obviously, a Sao Paulo strategy is a state of Brazil. It has it's a scientific superpower, right? It's like the engine of science in Brazil. So there are some particular elements of it that warrant its own strategy. The same is happening in Mexico. So Mexico City and the Mexico City government has created the first science policy fellowship for scientists to be immersed in different government agencies and to really boost this science, this city level science diplomacy and tech diplomacy and climate diplomacy, resilience. As we know, cities are increasingly acting as global actors. In Spain, we have Barcelona, which is now promoted by a group, SciTech DiploHub, promoting Barcelona as also a science diplomacy hub. So how do we train science diplomacy? There is no one way. Obviously, there are many different aspects to be covered. So when I was at AAAS, we developed this methodology that basically is not just about teaching the theory and practice and history and frameworks of science diplomacy. It is also about gaining the skills. So mostly by experiential learning, as Pedro was also mentioned, it's very important to have exercises. So diplomats in training, they all go through all these different simulation. You've seen perhaps Model UN and different ways of almost having real world scenarios to practice those skills. And so teaching how to communicate science to policymakers, negotiation, communication across cultures and sectors, finding the language that appeals to all your audiences, and obviously networking. So it's very useful for scientists to experience this immersion, the immersion in an ecosystem of science diplomacy, for instance, visiting embassies and international organizations. And for instance, in DC, we used to go to NASA, for instance, right, and see how NASA works globally in basically every program around the world. So it is very important for young people that's interested in bridging this divide to gain those skills at the same time that we build capacity in the foreign ministries and governments, the science policy interface structures and mechanisms that many institutions are doing, like the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, which is also an Inter-American intergovernmental organization dealing with global change in the Western Hemisphere, now has launched a science policy fellowship at the hemispheric level. And that makes all the sense to bring together people working on the same problem in different countries. They can then work as a cohort and exchange lessons and and work together across countries, because obviously all of these challenges are transboundary in nature. If you would like to know more about these mechanisms that I talk about these programs, they are all collected in this report that we published in 2017, Connecting Science to Policy Around the World. It's basically a landscape analysis of different mechanisms for connecting scientists and policy around the world. And let me finish by saying sometimes there are some misconceptions about science diplomacy, and I like to kind of prevent some of the questions that come. So I already said that science diplomacy is not just a domain of a national government. There are city and state level actors, there are supranational organizations. The role of scientific societies, academies of science, they're very important to act as a neutral bridge between academia and government. So it's a very good model if you want to have, for instance, a science policy fellowship, to have a scientific body like an academy, for instance, or a scientific like the AAAS, or in Brazil you have the SPBC, right? That can mediate and bridge the two communities. And there are so many different ways now of doing diplomacy that are heavily impacted by technology and innovation. For instance, there are ambassadors, like Denmark has an ambassador to Silicon Valley, right? So now the appointment of diplomatic missions to no longer just the national sovereign nation, but to an innovation hub like is Silicon Valley, for example. Also, we're not talking about scientists becoming politicians, although some do, and they're great. There was an article in the New York Times about Angela Merkel, the success of Germany's response in the pandemic being because she was a scientist. We don't know how much of that is true, but we are not talking about scientists leaving everything and becoming politicians, and also not politicizing science, right? So it's very important. Scientists want to be independent, and academic freedom is the most important value that we have. So it is not about using scientists as a political instrument. It is really about how science can help inform these discussions and policies. And at the same time, science cooperation does not equal science diplomacy, right? So there's international science cooperation happening all over the world on all sorts of topics, and not all of them have a diplomatic implication. So it is not about confusing and calling science cooperation science diplomacy, and we see sometimes this happening and confuses. And so importantly, finally, it is science does not dictate policy. Scientists don't tell what to do. Scientists provide the evidence, provide the options, and need to communicate very clearly with decision makers, but they do not decide, right? So there are so many competing interests, like political, economic, cultural, religious. There are so many different interests that a policymaker and a decision maker needs to take into account when they take a decision. So it is not just about science saying, oh, we need to stop climate change, here's what we need to do. Yes, but what are all the other sectors? How are we going to make this decision that our whole society can get on board, not just what the science says? So let's think about what the world we want, right? What the world will be after this pandemic, and what are the opportunities to really bring science and health and innovation to the center of foreign policy of the multilateral system, and innovate and create the structures that really work for this 21st century challenge. And I cannot leave you without talking about leadership. I think a lot of these questions come down to leadership. And I see a lot of women, heads of state doing really well. And I was part of a program that precisely tries to do that and to bring more women into the decision-making sphere. And this program is called Homeward Bound. It's in Antarctica. And this is where I was able to experience this idea of science for peace and science as a global common by going to Antarctica and sharing an experience with 100 women from all over the world, all with a scientific background, but with this will to create a more collaborative, legacy-minded, and basically inclusive leadership system than we have right now in many countries. If you want to know more, there's a course, online course on science diplomacy that we produce. It's completely free, and you can watch it anytime to expand on any of those issues. And I will send you this presentation so you have the articles and some of the resources that I mentioned. And finally, I will say that science diplomacy, it is fascinating. I would love for many of you to get involved. For me, it was a transformative journey. I ended up in places that I would have never imagined. For instance, in the Vatican, on a ship off the coast of Italy, in Antarctica, or diving a C-130 plane on the Red Sea. So it really does. It really brings you to a world that you don't really expect, and it's a career that you create as you go. And so it is. It's a pleasure for me to share this with you, and I hope to see you in August in the course. And muito obrigada. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Marga. We have a plenty of chat here saying that people were missing you, and I gonna open up the speaker to Professor Ariplonsky. I don't know if he has some comments or question, and the same to Luis Pierre Bruno, Professora Janina, and Pedro again. So please, Professor Ariplonsky.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if I can see my picture, but anyhow, it's not necessary. Marga, thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. I would just make one slight observation and then the question. The slight observation is that in the map of Antarctica, I think we are missing the Brazilian laboratory. And the question is the following. Nowadays, in many countries, including in Brazil, diplomacy or government is very much oriented to, let's say, a populist approach. And there is a theory which is called a deficit model that attributes public skepticism or hostility to science and technology to the lack of understanding of what science is, and this division of the world between expert and non-expert. And this has been difficult to overcome. How would you, because you presented the case that in countries where you have strong advisory sciences, it was not enough. But how would you recommend this approach between science and diplomacy in a moment, at least, or a period when diplomats are part of this hostility to science and technology?
Thank you so much. I think this is an excellent question. Yes, the deficit model is this idea that people don't trust science because scientists don't do enough to communicate. Basically, they need more facts and data thrown at them. And if only people would have more information, they would change their mind, right? So this is the deficit model that has been, of course, debunked many years ago, but we are seeing it now with this pandemic and before with climate change. And so there is no way of just putting more data out and magically people will change their mind. People only listen to data that reaffirms their beliefs. So it is very important that all of this science communication really appeals to people's lives and to people's values, right? So how can we communicate science, not from the expert to the lay people level, right? How can we change this paradigm and communicate science in a way that matters to people, that improves their lives, that shows that it is a positive thing for them, rather than trying to impose something on them that they don't want. So when the facts and the data conflict with their pre-existing beliefs, it has been shown that it is very, very difficult to change them. However, a few days ago, I read in the Financial Times, there's a column, I can't remember the name right now, but it was about the end of the two cultures. You know, this idea of CPs know that there were two cultures and science is kind of separated from society. And now, because of this popularity of scientific terms and having all of this scientific now basically language being mainstream and front page of the newspapers and in the news, it is now hopefully changing a little bit the perceptions about the importance and the value of science. So it's no longer about scientists in the ivory tower, in the lab, doing something we don't understand, that is very difficult, complicated. It's about scientists are looking for a vaccine that will literally get us out of this situation. Like, we are not able to move on and get back to normal until we have a solution. And scientists are the ones who will find it. And so the value of scientists and the value of science, I think, is now crystal clear. And people recognize that, both the public and the politicians. If you remember, Donald Trump in a press conference was asking scientists and the pharma companies to produce a vaccine like right now. Can you do it faster? Can you do it faster, right? So it is now, we are in the hands of science to get out of this situation. And it is interesting how the politicians who dismissed or did not value science or denied science directly in the past, now they're asking something that science cannot provide, because there is no way to produce a vaccine overnight, right? So the importance of understanding the scientific method, understanding what a vaccine is, what is a clinical trial, why we can't just inject people with something that hasn't been proved that it's safe. So it is a perfect opportunity, I think, for us to really change the perception of science, and not in a condescending way, but in a way that this is what helps people, right? And this is why we want more science advice, more scientists in government structures, in embassies, and in diplomatic relations, precisely because that is what helps people and what will get us out of this. And the question about why the countries with better science advice systems are not perhaps following the evidence is very important, because as I was saying, it is not enough to have those structures if the leader will not listen to them. So in the end, our best science advice mechanisms is our vote. So if you can have the best science advice in your foreign ministry in the world, but at the end, people elect their leaders. So it is our job to help people understand what leaders are going to be working in their best interests. And as I was talking about leadership and about these new models that I've been part of, these trainings, it's about long view, long-term collaboration and international global mindset. So if we can get people to vote these type of leaders, perhaps that's another way. So, the individual vote is still a very important mechanism, not just the expert science advice structure. So both are important.
So Marga, I think you can see some question and answers in your screen. The first three questions is about the fact. The first one is about the fact that there is some actors between diplomats and scientists, and
Yes.
the idea is how to deal with this in terms of promote foster science diplomacy. The second one is about the guarantee of to take visa in science diplomacy. How to guarantee visa is about it, how to get it. And the third one is the competition and the cooperation in medical aspect in situation as a pandemic. We prevail competition and cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go through a few of those. Yes, absolutely. There is an ecosystem. We call it ecosystem of science diplomacy. It is, so we simplify and we talk about scientists and diplomats, but this is obviously an oversimplification. There are so many actors that are involved in this ecosystem, and the question here, it mentions a few of them: research councils, as I was talking, academies of sciences. So there are state and non-state actors that complement each other. So we should not think about only the foreign ministries or the embassies or the diplomats have a role in here, and not only scientists as practicing scientists in academia. For instance, there is a big trend of forming this what is called boundary spanning professionals, right? Boundary spanning means people who have been trained in one of the two domains, but also knows how to interact and understand the other side, so they can be this bridge. And so this is not yet a very widespread training, because it's an interdisciplinary training that many countries don't really have the capacity, or they haven't found ways to foster those types of profiles that are also attached to having institutions that will house them, right? So one of the questions about that we get all the time that in science diplomacy trainings and initiatives is, okay, we train people, but then where do they go? So are governments and institutions willing to uptake these types of profiles that are kind of mediators and boundary spanning between the different worlds? Because if we don't create the spaces for them to go afterwards, basically we're creating a bubble, right, of people that are trained and very excited about a professional path that doesn't yet exist. So it's very important, I think, to foster those spaces. And the examples that I mentioned in Panama, in Mexico, different structures for bringing those profiles in and helping governments connect all the parts of the ecosystems. And the same applies to the embassies. And maybe Pedro Ivo can talk a bit more about this. How do you build your scientific expertise and capacity in the diplomatic missions? And that really differs across countries. Some countries are very strict in terms of who can occupy a position in a government office or an embassy, and sometimes there's almost competition between the diplomats and the science diplomats that go there. For instance, the US has an embassy science fellow program, so scientists can go for 3 months to an US embassy to support whatever program. The UK has this UK Science and Innovation Network, and they have scientists on the ground in many, many countries, and Brazil as well, as Pedro Ivo can talk about. But this is still not the majority. Most countries don't have those types of profiles. And if you think about traditional embassy staff, you think about political attaches, and you think about economic, and you think about culture and education, but science is not yet there at that level. So one of the recommendations is for countries to really create those spaces for the scientific capacity to build it across the entire ecosystem. And the competition versus collaboration, of course, that's an excellent question. I think it was Julia. We all remember Trump saying or attempting to buy a company in Germany that was making a vaccine. And I don't know, we don't know if this was like fake news or really was true. But just the idea of trying to get a vaccine only for your people, only for your country, and not for the world, that is a completely futile exercise. Because even if you succeed in getting the vaccine only for your people, then the rest of the world is going to bring the disease to you. So it doesn't make sense. So hopefully we will see the leaders and countries recognizing that, and that there is no point of just having something for you or just building a wall around you that so disease or climate change doesn't come in, because it doesn't work like that. So hopefully this will bring that clarity. I think you're on mute, Amancio.
I ask if Pedro Ivo and Professor Pierre Bruno wants to complement something. Pedro?
Yes, so just to the point that Marga mentioned, yes, I think different countries have different strategies with regards to the practice of science diplomacy, specifically in embassies, as she rightly pointed out. And this is the case of, for example, most of the European countries and also the US, where there are actual scientists or people or professionals who belongs to, let's say, scientific research institutions acting as science diplomats in the embassies and diplomatic missions. In the case of Brazil, we have diplomats mainly acting as science diplomats. That's my case here in New Delhi, in India. Let's say working on the bilateral relationship between India and Brazil and science and innovation diplomacy. I think, well, it's would maybe take another let's say, webinar to discuss what model is better, what model is worse. I think it very much depends on the, let's say, the intensity of the relationship and the nature of the relationship that and also the topics that are handled. The thing is that, and I think that is very important, and Brazil has particularly made, let's say, it's making a strong effort. My colleague Luis Fernando was here. I think he unfortunately left. He's, let's say, guiding the Brazilian science diplomacy from Brasilia. As the effort we've been making is that we have been providing more and more, let's say, training and really, let's say, useful information for those diplomats in the fields, in the embassies, to be able to deal and to, let's say, grow grow in their, let's say, responsibility as science and technology diplomats. So I think, as said, I think there are different strategies to it. We can discuss it further, but I think, let's say, in general, I think we have, let's say, different approaches.
Marga, let's back to some question. Probably you're not able to answer everything, but one of them is difference in science diplomacy and science international science cooperation.
Yes. Sorry, I was trying to read the questions and find them. Yes, so the confusion comes from, for example, when you have scientists collaborating from different countries on whatever topic that produces a paper that goes into an academic journal, and that has no relation with any other broader aspect. It is a collaboration for the sake of producing knowledge, right? So when we talk about diplomacy, I think we have to be a bit more strict because not all collaboration is diplomacy. Diplomacy is not a, it's not about just altruistic collaboration in the sense that many scientists understand it. Diplomacy is really a strategy for advancing national interests. And of course, some of your national interests are better advanced by working with others to jointly advance the interest if that is a goal for all of those involved. But really, it is not about just this sometimes can be naive view of collaboration for just the betterment of the world. And I would love for the diplomats to clarify a little bit. And I'm sure, Pedro Ivo, you've encountered this, the conflation between international collaboration and science diplomacy sometimes can dilute the diplomacy part, and that's what makes sometimes the diplomats not very happy. And maybe we could invite Professor Ruffini to comment on this, as he wrote an entire book, but also he was a science attaché for many years. So Professor Ruffini, would you like to comment?
Hello. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to join you this meeting. And first of all, I would like to thank you, Marga, for your great presentation. It's really a timely lecture. My point, I would like to ask you a question, not answering directly the one you just mentioned, but about the COVID, which is the core of your lecture. What strikes me, and you stressed that in your talk. What strikes me is the gap, really the contrast, strong contrast that we see between the reaction of the scientific community, which could answer quickly and coordinate at the global level on one side, and respond to reactions of the community of governments, policymakers in countries, which have so many difficulties to coordinate their response to the pandemic. And in some sense, I'm asking myself, there are interfaces, of course, at the global level between the global community of scientists and the political community, the community of states. But maybe what the lesson that we can draw from what is happening is that there is weakness. They are weak. Such interfaces are weak. And and maybe being a little bit provocative, does it not show some kind of failure of science diplomacy in some sense? Because at the global level, you see, we see that the capacity of collaboration, of coordination of the scientists didn't spill over at all towards the political community. And it could be possibly that decision makers, politicians, do not understand enough what is science, and should they understand better, maybe they could react or understand better the need to coordinate at the global level. Well, this is a question, this is a comment on a question. I don't know how you feel
Yes.
that, but that's my point right now.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Absolutely. I mean, that is the $1,000,000 question, right? I think there was
Sorry.
In the beginning, so COVID moved from, right, like the sun from east to west, and every country that could see it coming didn't see it coming, and then didn't act in the way that they could have probably anticipated some of the damage. So this is really baffling when we think about how come after you see each and every country coming before you, you don't put the mechanisms in place. But again, then how like I said in the presentation, it depends on having those mechanisms in place permanently, or having to scramble to get together the experts. And then even if you have those mechanisms permanently in place, then the decision maker deciding that they don't want them, or not listening to them, or those structures, those interfaces not working properly. So then the question, as you very well point out, is what is the role of the global structures? The global structures where all the countries have participation, and they are supposed to be the coordination body. The problem is that those structures are still very weak. So if you think about multilateral, any like the WHO, any multilateral structure, most of those recommendations or advice that they give are non-binding. So you cannot force a country, for instance, you cannot force China to disclose and be transparent about data, because there's no international enforcement mechanism that can force China to do anything in this space, right? So we have the UN Security Council, we have a few instances where the Security Council can activate sanctions and very strong measures against a country that does not comply or cooperate or participate in an agreement. But most of those agreements are non-binding. The same with climate change, right? So if you depend on voluntary contribution or voluntary disclosure of data or voluntary cooperation, because you cannot intervene within the national jurisdiction of any country, and that's very important to understand as well. So the UN is not a world government. They cannot interfere within the borders of a sovereign state. So you can give advice, recommendations, guidelines like the WHO has done, but you cannot force anything. And here I think it comes back to the soft and the hard power discussion that we had earlier. So if you want a country to share data with you, the best way is to build trust and to have a good relationship with that country before the conflict or before the emergency happens, because then you will be able to, in better terms, ask, can you disclose your infection data with me? If you are in bad terms, and if you are in a political challenging scenario like China and the US have been for a while, then it is much more difficult. It is much more difficult to enforce and force them to do something. And then it is easy to blame, oh, you should have disclosed your data earlier, so it's your fault that now we have this disease. But if you look back and go back to the origin of the problem, you can also trace it back to not having this global trust and this global coordination mechanism in a way that is not forcing people to do something, is not forcing countries to do something. It is understanding that it's in the best interest of all of them to share the data, to share the scientific information, to collaborate, because in the end, it's in the benefit of all, right? So does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. I agree with you. still, it's really paradoxical, the present situation, you see, because everybody seems to expect the magic solutions coming from science, and it will come out from science, and it will not be magic at all. It will be science, of course.
Right.
But at the same time, the one who decide are not the scientists at all. The one who decide in the end about the policies, they are the politicians, you see. And there is, I'm still, this this is really paradoxical to expect so much from science now and to be so weak, so unable on the political level to coordinate as scientists would probably recommend to do. From what we know about the virus, the way it transfers from all over the world without taking care of borders and so on. So that's
Yeah.
really a challenging, really challenging situation, and it shows the long way still to go for science diplomacy to to be fully effective in such a shock, in such a challenging situation.
Marga,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to react? Because I would you like to raise attention for a comment from Paulo Nascimento in the chat, and also a question from Laura Redondo. How can we coordinate the different speed of research and its protocol and the urgency of public policy? Other questions is about the role of non-state actors in science diplomacy. Several questions is raising this question. Thank you.
Yes, so the role of non-state actors, as we were saying, is very important to have an ecosystem of science diplomacy because precisely of the government and the political fluctuations. So the case that I was explaining with Cuba, in my work with Cuba, because I was part of a non-governmental organization that did not have any connection with the government, the US government, we were able to catalyze and fund and support relationship, scientific relationship, when the diplomatic relations were strained. And what that meant is that there was an economic embargo, meaning that you could not use any federal funding towards Cuba, right, for any purpose. So if there is no ecosystem of non-state actors and the two governments are not friendly, there are no other ways of advancing this science collaboration. If you have a robust ecosystem of non-state actors, those can help fill in when the diplomatic relations are not possible. So in our case, because we had non-governmental funding, we were able to freely move scientists and students and organize workshops and exchanges and joint research, a fellowship program for scientists to work in each other's labs. That would have not been possible if we didn't have a strong non-governmental side that allows the science to continue thriving when the political situation does not allow it. So that's, I think, the importance. It illustrates the importance of not just thinking and not focusing only on having science as a formal channel in a scientific attaché position, for instance, or in a government. So it is extremely important for the scientists to be able to freely move around and to freely collaborate without depending on the relationship, good or bad, between the governments. And it's also a good example that another project that we did, I was not directly involved, but my office did with North Korea. So it was a project that aimed to study a volcano that is in the border between North Korea and China. And that volcano had never been studied. It had never been looked at or examined by Western scientists, right? So North Korea had its own volcanologists and seismologists that were studying the volcano. But because there was a risk of eruption, eventually the volcano would erupt, the North Korea government realized that it was in their best interest to invite scientists from other countries to jointly study the volcano. Because if the volcano erupts, it is not just an impact in North Korea, it is an impact in all the neighbors, right? So it is an example of how science diplomacy, you can use it for your national interest in that case, but it really needs you to collaborate with others in order to address this national interest. And so the collaboration involved US, UK, and North Korean scientists working together to understand the volcano, and they published a paper in Science magazine to basically to legitimize that collaboration and show that it was not about a political show or theater or just handshake, because sometimes you can imagine some people just wanting to have a handshake in front of the flag and calling science diplomacy. But if in order to be effective, the science needs to be legitimate. So in this example, we had the Royal Society and AAAS as non-state actors helping North Korean scientists understand a problem that would eventually become a global problem. And only because the funding did not come from the governments, we were able to overcome the sanctions and install instruments in North Korea that were under sanctions because of potential dual-use technology, right? So these are examples of the importance of the non-state actors having that ecosystem. And I see a question that's related to this, so I will answer it. It's about the systems of government, so democratic or non-democratic, in the COVID response. So this is an extraordinarily complicated question. So we see better management of pandemic in places that you have no freedom of movement and you have control on your phone 24/7, and your doorknob is there's a sensor that if you leave your house, the government will know and somebody will come and say, no, you have to go home. So how it is extremely, complicated, and I don't think we can answer it. But how do you balance that, kind of top-down control, the measures and the solutions for a pandemic in a democratic system, and how do we balance those? Very, very important. Those are way beyond science diplomacy. They are bigger questions. And I don't know if any of you want to answer that question too. It's the question about China and Singapore. Any of the other panelists? Amancio, you're on mute again.
I think you covered every questions in general, and then you keep some questions for the second edition of the Inside. Okay,
Exactly.
Is that okay?
And we will be able to analyze more.
Yeah. So
winter for you.
Excellent. I'd like thank you very much, Marga, and the other Professor Lorena, Pedro Ivo, Professor Aris Plonsky, Janino Nuki, and you see again. Thank you very much for your excellent conference, Marga. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me and for being so active in the discussion.
Pedro, you can close the session.
Sure. Well, thank everybody. We had a really impressive audience here, and especially I'd like to thank Marga for taking her time to address us in this very specific, very, let's say, important topic. I have myself also many questions. I would also like to have engaged more in the discussion, especially on the role of governments diplomacy in a situation like this. But as my friend Amancio said, I think these unanswered and undiscussed topics we will leave for the second edition. So Marga, thank you very much. I invite everybody to continue the discussion on our social media. I think this is a very important topic, and we need to really keep the ball rolling. And well, I now officially declare this webinar closed.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Margaret. Thank you.
Bye-bye.